The idea for tonight's joint presentation grew out of a pelagic trip my husband and I took out of Westport in late September. Knowing I was soon going to be looking for speakers for WASP meetings, I decided to explore the option of a presentation on pelagic birding off the Washington coast. So while on the boat, I asked Bruce LeBar, a spotter with decades of experience, if he would be willing to speak to WASP about pelagic birding. He didn't even blink before he said, "Bill Tweit's the person you want to ask." Happily, Bill agreed to speak. In his day job, Bill is a special assistant for the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, representing the state on the regional body that manages fisheries in the Bering Sea and Gulf of Alaska. But as many of you already know, he's a serious and very accomplished birder. He's been associated with Westport Seabirds since he first arrived in Washington in 1973. In fact, his second day in the state was spent on a Westport Seabirds pelagic trip. He became a leader for them a few years later, and since then has been on hundreds of trips and co-authored several papers on data collected on Westport Seabirds trips with Terry Wahl. He was a regional editor for North American Birds for a couple of decades, was one of 3 authors of The Birds of Washington, published in 2005, and is now an eBird reviewer and a longtime member of the Bird Records Committee. Thank you for agreeing to speak, Bill. And as a Twitter subscriber, I have enjoyed videos Cara Borre occasionally posts on Tweeters of pelagic trip highlights, and I had the idea of inviting Bill and Cara to give a joint presentation, and I'm very grateful to them for agreeing. Cara has been a birder since 2008, when she and her partner took 2 trips to view wildlife in Belize and Ecuador. Birding at home in Washington soon became a priority. She took several classes, including Seattle Audubon's Master Birder class of 2013, and a class field trip introduced her to pelagic birding. She was immediately hooked because it combines her love of the sea with her joy in hunting for birds. In 2016, she was asked to join the Westport Seabirds team and continues to enjoy learning about pelagic wildlife and sharing that knowledge with others. Tonight, Cara will share with us short compilations of pelagic trip highlights that she and other participants have taken, and she also posts them on YouTube. And for those people who've been on, for some time, I'm going to repeat some information that Elaine has presented a couple of times. But I wanted to tell you that we are forging into new technical territory showing Cara's video, and you will have a role to play in accessing it. After Bill's presentation ends and Cara comes on, you will need to go to the chat and find a link that Elaine will type into the chat. When you click on that link, it will take you directly to her video, Best of the North Pacific 2020. It runs for just over 4 minutes, and you will be watching it from your very own screen. We will not be able to help you if you have trouble accessing it. So if that happens, and I hope it won't, please give yourself a 4-minute break and know that we will provide you with a link you can use later to see this video and others of Cara's on YouTube at your convenience. When the video ends, we'll reconvene for questions and answers. And that's it. Bill, welcome to the podium. Thank you.
Thank you, Vicki. Really appreciate the introduction. I'm delighted to be spending the evening with a couple of my Westport Seabirds co-leaders, as well as a lot of birders who I've gotten to know over the years in Washington, and some who I haven't yet met and who I look forward to meeting either offshore or somewhere else. Jennifer's introduction got me to thinking a little bit that I should inform you all that where I sit right now, I'm sitting in the ancestral lands of the Klickitat band of the Yakama Nation. And as I stare out the window at the incredible view here, grateful to them for their millennia of stewardship of these lands. And so even though it's a long ways away from Westport and the continental shelf, it's another part of our beautiful state. Appreciate that. So let me just check. Can everybody see my screen in screen display mode?
All in good shape, Bill.
Great. And now next thing is figure out whether or not I can actually advance. Anyway, my part of the presentation is to kind of build a bit of a foundation about the seabird life that's found over the continental shelf off Westport. Talk a little bit about some of what we've learned in 5 decades of keeping track of seabirds off Westport, and talk a little bit about some of the status and trends, and then turn it over to Cara, who will give you a real sense of what it's really like to be out there. Her videos are so wonderful for that. Looks like it's advancing. Is everybody seeing a second slide?
Yes, yes.
Excellent. So first I want to talk a little bit about the ecosystem, the California current ecosystem, and then a little bit about introduce you to the boat we use that hopefully a lot of you have been on already, and then do just a quick run through of some of the birds of some of the more characteristic birds of each of the habitat zones that we visit, talk a little bit about mammals and other marine life, and then conclude by talking some about some of the trends that we've seen over time with some of the species that we keep track of everything out there. Some of them don't show in the way of trends, but some of them have some really interesting stories in terms of trends. And so I'd like to share a few of those with you. The California current ecosystem. The California current is one of only a handful of what are called eastern boundary currents in the world's oceans. And these tend to be some of the most productive currents anywhere in the world's oceans. One of the other famous ones in the Pacific is the Humboldt Current. I think a lot of you may be aware of just the rich seabird life that can also be found in the Humboldt Current. There are other eastern boundary currents elsewhere in the world's oceans, but as I say, the California current is relatively unique globally because of it's one of a few, and it is one of the most productive. As you can see from the graphic on the left, the California current arises from an eastward flowing current that crosses the North Pacific just south of the Aleutians, called the North Pacific Current. The origin of the North Pacific Current is actually in the Kuroshio, which is the northward moving current off Japan. It's also quite productive, but it's not an eastern boundary current. And so the California current really begins to come close to shore, very close to shore, down near the Oregon-California border. But even in our area, it still exerts a tremendous influence. And oceanographers talk about the California current ecosystem as extending really from the southern tip of Baja north to about the north tip of Vancouver Island. North of there, the North Pacific Current, the other part of the North Pacific Current bifurcates and goes into the Alaska Current and the Gulf of Alaska gyre, which is another highly productive marine ecosystem. The close-up, the more focused close-up figure on the right shows the complex interplay between the California current system, and this is a winter snapshot, and so it shows you also the Davidson, which in the winter is a near shore northward moving current that's bounded on the west by the southward flowing California current. And we still see some signs of a Davidson type current even in the summer. There's a fair number of birds that make use of that northward moving conveyor belt. For instance, the common murres that fledge off the Oregon coast when the chicks are still flightless and the males become flightless, ride northward in that near shore current. But further offshore, you finally get into the California current ecosystem when it's southward moving. Focusing in even a little bit more on the topography, the marine topography off Washington, our continental shelf has several notable attributes that along with the presence of the California current contribute to the productivity of the waters off Washington. And the reason why a Westport Seabirds pelagic trip is really birdy. We often talk to people from other parts of the world who come out on a Westport Seabirds pelagic trip, and they're they're just not used to seeing birds all the time. They're used to moving across some sometimes pretty large empty areas of the ocean and not seeing any birds for quite a while. And so we almost always have birds in view off Washington, and often numbers. And that's explained by the productivity, which has several factors. One is the continental shelf itself is rather broad, and the continental shelf is, in many parts of the world, one of the main areas of marine productivity, because you get both current-driven upwelling as well as wind-driven upwelling. It's shallow enough that the winds, as they move the surface waters at a 90-degree angle to the direction of the wind, that tends to move those surface waters away from shore, and that generates then an upward sort of pulling of the deep waters, which are the nutrient-rich waters over the shelf. Submarine canyons aid in that by providing additional areas where marine currents can interact with the actual ocean floor in the complex topography of canyons and generate upwelling as well, just by the subsurface marine currents hitting the walls of the submarine canyons, and then with that nutrient-rich water being forced upwards. And finally, we have some very large estuaries, the Columbia, the Willapa, Grays Harbor, the Salish Sea, that also put large amounts of nutrients into the waters off of our coast. And so this wonderful mixing zone within the California current ecosystem creates the productivity that we enjoy and attracts the bird life that we enjoy. So the upwelling, the oceanographic features that we think about when we're sort of thinking about where to go birding off our coast are, first off, and I've talked about this a fair amount, the amount of upwelling. Second is the degree of salinity in the water. And Washington, the waters off Washington and to a lesser extent Northern Oregon are sort of unique in that waters are somewhat lower salinity than much of the rest of the ocean because of the tremendous inputs of fresh water, particularly out of the Columbia and out of the Salish Sea. So the waters that are sort of bounded on the west by the main part of the California current, this somewhat lower salinity zone, oceanographers refer to it as the dilute domain. And it tends to have its own fairly unique community of birds. For instance, black-footed albatross tolerate lower salinities than laysan. Laysan really prefer high salinity water. So we get blackfoots and we get the occasional laysan, but they're not as regular as they are, say, off Alaska, where mostly high salinity water and blackfoots become pretty rare. So salinity plays a big role. We also believe it plays a role in where some of the other truly pelagic seabirds like the pterodroma petrels, the areas that they choose to inhabit tend to be the higher salinity also. But many of the shearwaters, particularly sooties and pinkfoots, do very well in somewhat lower salinity waters, and so we get good numbers of those. We also look for plumes, which are areas where water from one body is extending into waters of another current. So we'll get higher salinity plumes sort of reaching in from the offshore California current into the dilute domain. And sometimes those plumes even turn into gyres and break off from the main body of water and move around. And while those aren't as much a feature off Washington as say further south where the currents are even more complex, still we occasionally get a gyre of more pelagic water off Washington, and with that may come some of the birds that we see as well. So it's, even though everybody thinks of the ocean as relatively homogeneous, it's really not. It's a variety of habitats, and in some cases even a variety of ecosystems. So let's start exploring this environment through the eyes of some birds and some birders. First, our platform. we've been using the Monte Carlo now since, oh gosh, 1985. Phil Anderson and his wife, Chris Anderson, are the owner operators, and Phil is the skipper of the Monte Carlo. And prior to that, Westport Seabirds used a variety of vessels for our pelagic trips, some of which have since been sold and are no longer even in Westport, some of which were best forgotten after just a trip or two. And so we're thrilled to have the Monte Carlo, which Phil keeps in top shape, and because he's got a bit of an electronics hobby, there's always the latest and greatest in terms of electronics up in the bridge, which is good for safety, but it's equally good for finding birds. In fact, his newest radar can now see flocks of birds, and he can also communicate through his electronics with skippers of fishing vessels that we can't even quite see on the horizon and hear what they're doing. And I'll tell you why that's important in just a few. So the zones we travel through as we go offshore, and these are zones that we've begun to sort of piece together based on the stories that the birds themselves actually tell us, and then sort of figuring out what it is about the ecosystem and in particular the topography out there that sort of fits with what the birds are telling us. And these are zones that initially Terry Wahl, who some of you may know and all of you should know of, began to work out when he started Westport Seabirds back in the late 60s, and from the very trip started counting birds. He started to notice these patterns fairly quickly and develop his names for the zones, but also just develop the definitions for the zones. And we've used those since because they still make sense. The nearshore area, which we call which is sort of the inner half of the continental shelf, waters less than 50 fathoms, which is about 300 feet in depth. Relatively shallow waters, strong coastal influence. We can often feel the effects of the tides moving in and out of Grays Harbor out to nearly to the 50 fathom line. We can sometimes see harbor colored water or things like eelgrass floating in small pockets that tell us very clearly that the Grays Harbor tidal exchange has a lot of influence on this zone. And for us, the two most characteristic birds of this zone are sooty shearwaters and common murres. And particularly with common murres, it's fairly rare, particularly in summer, to see murres outside of that 50 fathom line, and whereas they can be absolutely abundant within that 50 fathom line. So they're actually one of the best markers of how close you are to shore. Even when you can't quite see shore, as soon as you start seeing your strings of common murres on the water, you know that you're getting close to shore as you're returning. Other nearshore birds, and here I've got to move my thing around a little bit. Parasitic Jaegers in the upper right. We see them well offshore as well, but they're the Jaeger that we most consistently see near shore. There's a string of murres flying by, and then the brown pelicans are also birds of the nearshore environment. And all of a sudden, hang on, I've lost, oh, there we go. Got my controls back again. Then we move to the outer shelf. Waters greater than 50 fathoms out to the shelf edge, which is sort of variously defined as 100 to 150 fathoms. And in that area, we begin to pick up more of the marine influences, and the coastal influences really drop off. This is where the majority of the commercial fishing that we're interested in occurs. We're not too interested in, say, following crab boats around because they don't have much bycatch, and there's not much to attract seabirds other than gulls to a crab boat. But the trawlers and the longliners that are fishing for rockfish, fishing for whiting or for halibut or black cod, all of those are fishing in the outer shelf area. The pink shrimp trawlers as well. Another gear that often has a lot of birds behind it. And so I'll show you a couple of photos of what that looks like in a later slide. But if there's a fishing vessel that's working and not just running, we will often detour up to several miles in order to go check out whether they've attracted any birds or not. The diversity of both tube noses and ulcids also increases dramatically. Usually we don't see our first pink-footed shearwaters, albatross, fullers shearwaters, or even storm petrels or Cassin's auklets, and often no puffins either until we're outside of 50 fathoms. So it's the area we really start looking for. And here we're showing a pink-footed shearwater coming in over a black-footed albatross. Other critters of the outer shelf in winter, that's where we often find black-legged kittiwakes. In spring and fall migration, the Sabin's gulls are rarely seen within over the inner shelf, but become regular once we're out past 50 fathoms. I'm showing Cassin's auklet there in the lower right, and then one of our favorite birds that this is a bird we call out every time we see it. You know, some trips we don't get any occasionally. Usually we get one or two. Sometimes we have a great trip where we get into the double digits on South Polar skuas. And that's a South Polar skua on the water there in the upper right. And these are all, as I say, we begin to really look hard for these once we pass that 50 fathom line. I can say that without stumbling too often. Here's what I mean about the commercial fishing effect. This is a trawler. The Pacific Dove is actually a shrimp trawler usually, and it's right now in this photo here in the lower left, you can see it's rigged for shrimping. Those booms that are hanging off each side are shrimp trawl booms, and you can see all the shearwaters, mostly sooty, but I think I can pick out a pink foot or two in there. Just pattering over the surface right above the trawl as it's coming up on board. And the reason it's doing that is that even though trawls are designed to capture and retain everything that swims, unfortunately is in front of the mouth as it moves through the water, as the net comes up, a few things pop out through the net. And so the birds can scavenge off those pretty easily. And then the other thing is after the catch is brought on board, and everything but the pink shrimp is generally required to be thrown back overboard, whether it's dead or alive. And it's not a lot of biomass. The pink shrimp fishery is quite clean. In fact, it's certified as sustainable by the Marine Stewardship Council, which is a global certification. And one of the things they pay attention to is the amount of fish that get caught and discarded. So it's not a high volume, but it's enough, and they float long enough that the birds can make a pretty good living off of the fairly small amount of bycatch that goes overboard after each trawl. And again, here in the upper right, you can see there's the floats that actually mark the top of the trawl net, the opening. And again, with some shearwaters, they know the net's about to come up and food's about to be available. And then one of the inveterate ship followers is here in the lower right. Northern fulmars really know how to follow fishing vessels, and in fact, the amount of commercial fishing is thought to be the explanation for tremendous population increases of northern fulmars in the North Atlantic ecosystems, as well as in the North Pacific ecosystems. So they're not dependent on commercial fishing, but commercial fishing has made their lives very good. So I talked about both trawlers on the left and also longliners on the right. And one of the reasons we like when we see a longliner is that they tend to really attract albatross, much more so than some of the other birds. And it's because of the unique nature of their fishing. Some of you may have heard that globally there's a real problem with longliners and albatross. Albatross, if the longliner is not careful and fishing it properly, albatross can grab onto the hooks that go overboard on the longline, and each hook has bait on it, and then get caught on the hook and unfortunately killed. I want to reassure you that in the United States, that problem was recognized almost 2 decades ago, and a tremendous amount of research has gone on about how to minimize that. And the take of albatross now in US longliners is down to a small handful of albatross every year. Some amount of mortality is still unavoidable, but the US has taken great measures, and further, those measures have now been shared globally. And so longliners from other countries have been able to benefit from the US experience and how to minimize mortality. So back to moving west. The closest submarine canyon to Gray's Harbor is Gray's Canyon, appropriately named. It's just about due west of Grays Harbor, and that's the one we usually head for, but there are canyons to the north and south, the Willapa to the south and the Quinault to the north, that sometimes will head to those as well, and they're all equally productive. Here you get into the truly deep water. It's fun when we hit the edge of Gray's Canyon. If you want to go up into the wheelhouse and just watch the fathometer that displays the topography below you, the seafloor below you, you can just see, just like a true canyon on land, that the bottom just plunges away. And we almost always try to do a chum stop at the west end of the canyon, where the main north-south line of the continental shelf is, just because it's an area of real mixing. And it's as close as we get to sort of the truly high seas pelagic waters. Some of our trips keep going past the west end of Gray's Canyon out into the beyond the shelf waters. And we do that for a couple species, but the birders often note that when we keep going west past the west edge of the canyon, bird abundance really drops off and diversity really drops off. You pick up a few species that you rarely see in closer, like Leach's storm petrel in particular, and so it's worth going out there, but the main show is always over the shelf, and that's because the main productivity is over the shelf. Once you're past the shelf, productivity decreases and becomes much more patchy. So our 3 primary zones then are the near shore, the offshore, and Gray's Canyon, the submarine canyons. If we haven't seen albatross or fork-tailed storm petrels closer to shore, we'll find them over the canyon, at least 99.9% of the time. But we also start to get into other interesting things. In the lower left, you see a beautiful pair of long-tailed Jaegers sitting together on the water. They tend to be very deep water birds, and so the canyon's often our best bet for them. In the upper right, a pair of Scripps' merlets that also we will sometimes find them inshore of the shelf edge of the canyon, but most of our records come from these deeper waters around the edge of the canyon and over the canyon and further west. And then in the middle, I'm showing a short-tailed shearwater, which again, we don't always find them, but if we do find them in the late summer, in years when they're showing up in the late summer, they're typically out at the western edge and often over the canyon. So let me switch gears briefly and talk a little bit about some of the marine mammals that we see. And this is by no means a complete inventory, just as what you saw in the birds aren't. But we get both cetaceans and pinnipeds. Pinnipeds include northern fur seal, and this is two different shots of northern fur seals. And in recent years, we've learned that we also occasionally find Guadalupe fur seals, which is really exciting because that's the fur seal that breeds primarily off Mexico. Northern fur seals breed almost entirely in Alaskan waters, although there's a small colony now off of Southern California, oddly enough, almost down into Guadalupe fur seal country. Guadalupe fur seals were thought to be virtually extinct and are one of the more successful recoveries of marine mammals in over the last few decades. And so learning that they extend almost this far north has been one of our discovery moments, and we're still working through exactly how to tell them apart without getting a really close view, but we're getting there. We see some cetaceans almost every trip. It used to be primarily gray whales and Dall's porpoise and harbor porpoise, and with the occasional minke whale thrown in. In more recent years, and then every once in a while we'd get lucky with Pacific white-sided dolphins, and those are Pacific white-sided dolphins there in the center bottom, the three animals porpoising out of the water. And then every once in a while with the Pacific white-sideds, we'd find northern right-whale dolphins, that marine mammal that's entirely out of the water, that lacks the dorsal fin entirely, thus has a very curious shape, is the northern right-whale dolphin, and those are always very exciting. For us, and I'll talk about this a little bit more later, one of the more exciting discoveries in recent years has been watching the population growth of humpback whales, shown there in the lower left. And we're seeing more and more killer whales, which we think are primarily the Biggses killer whales or the transient killer whales, the marine mammal eaters. We do sometimes also see the southern resident killer whales as they journey out of the Salish Sea and into their into the southern waters. And I realize I've still have a ways to go and I'm talking too much, so I'm going to pick up the pace a little bit. Fish and other marine life, ocean sunfish, that large, oddly shaped white thing in the left side, and then blue sharks. I'm just featuring the dorsal fin of a blue shark there in the lower right, are the two fish that we see most commonly. And then something that we see on occasion, but when we do, they're often in huge numbers, are Velella, shown here. It's an invertebrate that floats on the surface, distantly related to jellyfish, very distantly, actually more distantly related to Portuguese man-o-war than jellyfish. Also called by-the-wind sailors, but sometimes they occur in massive numbers, and that's always exciting too. Discoveries. And somebody tell me when we just should switch gears and go to Cara, because as usual I'm running too long. But when Terry Wahl first started running pelagic trips out of Westport, virtually nothing was known about the seabirds off the Washington coast. And so, for instance, prior to 1968, there'd been one report of Buller's shearwater off Washington. Terry got them on some of the first trips he ran in 1968, and since then we've seen them annually as fall migrants. In the lower center there, flesh-footed shearwater. Similarly, there was one record prior to the start of our pelagics, and now we know that they can be seen almost every year in both spring and fall in small numbers. And then another conservation success story is short-tailed albatross, formerly known to be a fairly regular seabird, not just off our coast, but even into the Salish Sea. So much so that their bones actually appear in Indian middens. they had disappeared, as everybody knows, near extinction before World War II. And we saw our first one in 1993. And since then, their numbers have slowly increased to the point where it's still a fantastic bird. We're still very excited when we see it. But we look for it now. We know that it's possible. And that's just a huge testament to the power of global conservation efforts for this magnificent seabird. We've discovered a lot of rarities over the years, and some of them still have us sort of scratching our heads about what exactly is going on. For instance, one of those that's a head scratcher is great shearwater. Our first one was in 2002. This is a bird normally found in the Atlantic Ocean, but they winter as well. They breed well south in the Atlantic, and once you go around Cape Horn, you begin to see great shearwaters pretty quickly. So it's quite conceivable that a few of them would just go north on the wrong side of Cape Horn and end up in the Pacific rather than the Atlantic. And so it makes some sense to us that they'd show up occasionally, but weirdly enough, we had 2 years, 2013 and 2015, where there were numbers of them out there. We still don't know what happened. We saw 5 in August of those 2 years together, which, given that it took us until 2002 to see our first, that was pretty extraordinary. Ashy storm petrels, which are endemic to the California current ecosystem, but are typically found south of the Oregon-California border. We recognized our first one in 2006, and then more recently had the second one in 2019, both times in June. And it got us to realizing, maybe we got to stare at storm petrels a little more carefully. They may come further north than we've been thinking. And with climate change and the changes in the oceans, that may be more frequently. Here's one that's definitely a changing ocean bird, and that's brown booby, the lower center there. We had our first one in 2002, and since then, we've seen them several different times, and as many of you know, they've become common enough, frequent enough in Washington now that they're no longer even a bird on the bird records review list. A couple that are still incredible rarities in the North Pacific, for us, in the North Pacific, are shy albatross, we've just seen once, and then Hawaiian petrel that we've only seen once from the Monte Carlo, but we now know from repositioning cruises, they occur very rarely, but a little more regularly off Washington. So some changes over time. One of our favorite ones, because we play a big role in understanding this one, is Manx shearwater. Another shearwater that is confined to thought to be confined to the Atlantic, but Manx in the winter occur south almost to Cape Horn. So again, the idea that a few Manx could just make a wrong turn and end up in the Pacific isn't too much of a stretch. But we were stunned to find a Manx shearwater off Westport in 1990, and that was actually the first record off of the west coast of North America. People in years prior seen the occasional black and white shearwater that they'd wondered about, but nobody had been able to get a good enough look. So we actually recorded the first one, and fairly shortly after that, California started to get records. Oregon got a few, British Columbia got some records, and finally Alaska got records, including birds potentially near breeding islands. And you can see the increase. First off, you can see all those years when we never saw Manx shearwater, even though we were looking. And then the increase we've seen in more recent half decades as the population has slowly built up. And it's now accepted that they are a regularly occurring and likely breeding seabird in the Northeast Pacific. So we got sort of a front row seat in watching that colonization process, which is exciting. Lace-on albatross, another one that we've had a bit of a front row seat watching, as they've also colonized the Northeast Pacific, establishing a breeding population off of Mexico. And we think that it's the Mexican population that contributes a lot of our birds, although we don't have a lot of band recoveries to substantiate that. But you can see here over the years where Manx went from a once every few years bird in the 70s to all of a sudden this big jump up, which shortly after the Mexican colonies got established. And it's overall, even though there's a lot of interannual and even interdecadal variability, there's still clearly a steady, a slow but steady increase in the number of lace-on albatross that we record. And another positive story, and this one is truly a conservation success that's just fantastic. Again, you look at the early records from the 70s and even really through the 80s and into the 90s, pretty flat and pretty near zero for humpback whales. There was a big, big deal when we had a humpback whale, and then almost an exponential rise starting in the mid-90s. And particularly through the first decade of this century, just a phenomenal rise. So it's not uncommon for us now in summer to have at least one or two trips where we will have over 15 humpbacks. You know, many of them are sighted in the distance and all that, but still, just a completely different population status than we'd experienced in our first few decades. And humpback whales are great because they've got so much personality. They're a real crowd pleaser. But it's also just heartwarming to see this kind of a conservation success story. And again, we've had a row seat on this. Now we've watched some other things that have been a little more painful. Many of you are probably aware tufted puffin has now been declared an endangered species in the state of Washington under Washington state law, Endangered Species Act law. And here's the reason why, shown really clearly. And in fact, some of our data was actually used, all of our data was used by my agency, along with a lot of other data sets, all of which showed roughly the same trend. But you can see that tufted puffins have been on a long-term decline for quite a while. Were hit particularly hard in the very rough years in the 1990s when the California current ecosystem was bedeviled by a series of warm water events related to El Niños, but showed a little bit of bounce back after that, but then started declining again. And what for us was a saw it on every trip bird back in the 70s is now see a couple times a year bird. And we hope at least it stays at that. Another one that everybody I know is already familiar with is the decline in marbled murrelets. Again, we used to almost always see a handful of marbled murrelets off the jetties off Grace Harbor on just about every pelagic trip. And now we get them once or twice a year as well, very similar to puffins. Back to a little bit of good news though. Even though brown pelican really isn't one of our offshore birds, we keep track of it. And so I thought I'd show this because this is using Westport Seabirds data. And I should have said all of these are all done using Westport Seabirds data, the data we collect every trip we're out there, and it's all paid for by bird watchers. So you can see this tremendous rise of brown pelicans that I think everybody's familiar with. But for those of you who are relatively recent birders to Washington, brown pelican used to be a bird that if you heard about one, you drove to the coast. It was a rarity that people chased. As you can see now, it no longer, see some of our total trip counts just average in the 2010 to 2014 time period. In the fall, we averaged 800 pelicans a trip, mostly within Grace Harbor. That's a big difference from one pelican every few years in the 70s. So I'm about to wrap up. I just want to talk a little bit about, I've mentioned climate change a couple times, and we still don't understand all the connections, but we do know that the increased frequency of huge marine heat waves, very large scale, unprecedented size, is related to, it's predicted by all the climate change models and is clearly related to many of the changes that we're seeing now in our climate. And it's these, excuse me while I turn my timer off. It's these marine heat waves that we think may shape our future because seabirds are they're not sensitive to the temperature per se, but they're very sensitive to the ecosystem level changes that occur when waters warm over as broad an area and by as much magnitude as we saw in, the blob, for instance, the famous blob in 2014, 2015, and some recurring episodes of these large marine heat waves like in 2019. The entire food chain changes, and in fact, that's one of the ways that oceanographers and marine biologists can tell whether or not we're in a marine heat wave, is the plankton communities radically different. And those plankton, they're different species, they behave a bit differently, and they have different caloric content and fat content. And typically, the warmer water plankton have a lower caloric content, so less valuable to fish, so less bait fish growth. So the seabirds that are plankton eaters suffer. Equally, the seabirds that eat bait fish that feed on the plankton suffer in these years because the food resource is smaller, less nutritious, and more widely spaced. So the foraging conditions are different and they don't get the same amount of caloric intake that they have been depending on. Again, remember I talked about the California current ecosystem as being a very rich ecosystem, and so that it makes it worthwhile for birds like sooty shearwaters to make these tremendous around the North Pacific migrations from their breeding grounds in the Southern Hemisphere off of Chile and off of Australia and New Zealand because they can really tank up before they make the long journey back south across relatively inhospitable waters for them. So when the food source is diminished, it creates ripples throughout the seabird food chain. So we'll just have to see what sort of effect this has long term on seabirds. Again, we'll have a front row seat for that. And I think most of you know this. I meant to pull it out, actually. I think I have an overall. I did want to just briefly mention that for at least this year, 2021, we will continue to maintain COVID protocols. And those worked very successfully last year once we started running trips. And they really work well with birders. And as far as we know, we had no issues of COVID transmission at all, and we would have heard about it if we had. So finally, let me just do really quickly acknowledge a lot of people because this is Westport Seabirds is the product of a huge amount of birders in a lot of different roles. First and foremost, Terry Wahl, shown here on the left. Terry established Westport Seabirds and is the mentor for most of us who are now Westport Seabirds leaders, and became a very accomplished seabird biologist in his own right, as both working with Westport Seabirds, but also leading other research projects as well, and really gave us this science foundation so that I could present these kinds of results to you. We all owe Terry a huge debt of gratitude. Equally, Phil and Chris Anderson And then my comrades, my colleagues, the other Westport Seabirds leaders, and we've had quite a few over the years. Dennis Paulson was one of the earliest ones with Terry, and really helped also lay down a great foundation for us. Dennis Heineman, also from those early years. Michael Donahue, who many of you know, was the leader with us for quite a while. Bruce Labar, who's on the phone today, I believe. Scott Mills. I think we've also got Jim Danzenbaker, Gene Revelis, and Bill Shelmerdine on the phone. And then you'll hear from Cara here shortly if I ever shut up. But finally, I want to acknowledge all of you who've gone out with us, because you're the ones who've actually helped make sure that the platform is there for us to keep this kind of observational database going. Most of you who've been out have heard me say that the Westport Seabirds has the longest running database on seabirds anywhere in the world. And it's because it's not dependent on government grants. It's not dependent on a lot of other things. It's simply dependent on you as birders being willing to go offshore. And we can show you the birds and we can collect data at the same time, and everybody loves it. So thank you all for that. And finally, here's our schedule for 2021. We're excited about running a full season. Our website's got all these dates. And 3 albatross species want to
Great, thank you. And thanks, Bill. That was a wonderful presentation. I learned a lot myself, so fabulous. The video, this is a new one. So unless you cheated and looked on YouTube before, this is going to be new, and it's the best of 2020. And, you know, having lived through 2020, who would have thought we would ever use best of and 2020 in the same sentence? But we actually can with the trips we had. We actually only did 2 fewer trips, which is unbelievable. 2 fewer trips than we normally do, though we didn't start those trips until near the end of June. But Phil was very adaptable, and he got extra trips in there, and everybody was interested. We took fewer people, but we really got out there. We had some great species and great documentation of those species. Of course, I didn't get to see all of them, so I had this idea that I want to do a best of, and I solicited photographers and really kind of put a list together. Moped around for a while, depressed at the end of 2020 and the beginning of 2021. But really this presentation sort of got me out of my funk and kicked my butt into gear. So I completed this project that hopefully we'll all get to enjoy together if the technology works for us. It was a little bit challenging to make this work in a streamlined way, but hopefully.
Oh, I'm newly calibrated, all shiny and clean. I'm your recent adaptation, time to redefine me. Let the word out, I've got to get out. Oh, I'm feeling better now. Break the news out, I've got to get out. Oh, I'm feeling better now. Oh, I'm happy as Christmas, all wrapped to be seen. I'm your recent acquisition, time to celebrate me. Let the word out, I've got to get out. Oh, I'm feeling better now. Break the news out, I've got to get out. Oh, I'm feeling better. World's done shaking, the world's done shaking, the world's done shaking me down. The world's done shaking, the world's done shaking, the world's done shaking me down. done shaking, the world's done shaking me down. The world's done shaking, the world's done shaking, the world's done shaking me down.
Everybody still there? Feeling a little queasy? God, that was fantastic. I mean, how in the world you did that with your cell phone? Thank you. Thank you. Scott Downs has put in a nice comment that you, Bruce, Scott, Karen, all the other leaders have made Seabirds one of Sierra's favorite bird groups. And if you don't know Sierra, Sierra is one of our Patrick Sullivan awardee persons. Thanks to Westport Seabirds, says it all.
Well, that's great. Hopefully, we'll see them both out there this season. Can't wait.
Okay, Vicki.
Well, I think that wraps up our evening. I'm again thankful to our presenters for just an outstanding presentation and varied in a way we haven't had before, and invite everyone back for a member meeting night, and then send recommendations for good presentations like this so we can share them widely with other people. And I'll look forward to seeing you again on October 4. Have a good evening. Thank you so much.
I hope we'll get to see a lot of you on June 7th, although Vicki is going to take a break.
Have another engagement. Okay.
Members photo night, June 7th. Thanks, everybody. Really grateful.
Good night.
Good night, everybody, and thank you all.
Good night, everyone.